The Man Who Tried to Copyright Silence. It's a crisp September morning in 2002, and somewhere in a London recording studio, a British musician sits at a grand piano bench, adjusts his jacket, stares at the ivory keys for exactly 60 seconds, then gets up and walks away. He's just composed what he calls a 1-minute silence, and within months, he'll find himself staring down a lawsuit for copyright infringement, not for stealing someone's melody, not for lifting their lyrics, but for supposedly plagiarizing the sound of nothing itself. This is the peculiar tale of Mike Batt, the man who inadvertently challenged one of the most provocative questions in modern art. Can you own emptiness? Can you copyright the void? And it all began with another man's revolutionary idea about what music could be. A soft-spoken American composer named John Cage, who half a century earlier had dared to suggest that silence might be the most important sound of all. But to understand how we arrived at this absurd moment in legal history, where lawyers would argue over who owned the rights to nothingness, we need to travel back to a small mountain town in New York, to a warm August evening in 1952. When an audience filed into the Maverick Concert Hall expecting to hear music and instead witnessed something far more profound. The venue itself was fitting for what was about to unfold. Built in the 1920s as part of an artist's colony, the Maverick Concert Hall sat nestled among towering pines and maples, its rustic wooden beams and simple benches creating an atmosphere more akin to a forest chapel than a concert venue. The audience that evening was a mix of curious locals, avant-garde enthusiasts, and skeptical traditionalists, all drawn by whispers of something unusual about to happen. At exactly 8:30 p.m., a young pianist named David Tudor walked onto the small stage, adjusted the piano bench, and sat down. He opened the keyboard lid, positioned his hands above the keys, and then did nothing. For 4 minutes and 33 seconds, Tudor sat motionless at the piano, his hands poised but never striking a key. Occasionally, he would close and reopen the keyboard lid to mark the 3 movements of the piece, but otherwise, he remained perfectly still. The piece was called 433, and it would become one of the most controversial compositions of the 20th century, though whether it was actually a composition at all would remain a matter of fierce debate for decades to come. If you love uncovering these hidden tales of art, pushing against the boundaries of the possible, you'll feel right at home here. Stick around for more. The man behind this silent symphony was John Cage, and his journey toward creating music out of silence had been years in the making. Born in Los Angeles in 1912 to an inventor father and a journalist mother, Cage had grown up in a household where unconventional thinking was encouraged. His father, John Milton Cage Sr., held patents for inventions ranging from submarine periscopes to radio receivers, while his mother, Lucretia, wrote for the Los Angeles Times during an era when few women worked in journalism. This environment of innovation and questioning authority would prove formative for young John. After studying at Pomona College and spending time in Europe, where he was exposed to the avant-garde movements sweeping through art and literature, Cage returned to California in the 1930s with his mind buzzing with possibilities. He began studying composition with Arnold Schoenberg, the revolutionary Austrian composer who had broken music free from traditional tonality. But even Schoenberg's radical approach wasn't radical enough for Cage. While his teacher was reinventing how notes related to each other, Cage began wondering why music had to be limited to notes at all. Why couldn't the sounds of everyday life, traffic, conversations, industrial noise be just as valid as the carefully tuned tones produced by traditional instruments? This questioning led him to experiment with what he called prepared pianos. Conventional pianos with objects like screws, bolts, rubber bands, and pieces of weather stripping inserted between the strings. When the pianist struck the keys, instead of pure tones, they would hear metallic clanks, wooden thumps, and otherworldly buzzes. It was as if Cage had turned the piano into an entire percussion orchestra, each key producing sounds that no one could predict or fully control. But the prepared piano was just the beginning. In the 1940s, Cage began incorporating chance operations into his compositions, using techniques derived from the ancient Chinese oracle book, the I Ching. Instead of deciding which notes to play based on his personal taste or traditional harmonic rules, he would flip coins or consult random number tables to determine the structure of his pieces. The resulting music was unlike anything anyone had heard before, sometimes beautiful, sometimes jarring, always surprising. These experiments were leading Cage toward a profound realization about the nature of music itself. If he could make music by preparing pianos, if he could compose by flipping coins, if he could incorporate everyday sounds into his pieces, then what exactly was music? Was it simply organized sound? And if so, what about the sounds that occurred without any organization at all? The ambient noise that surrounded us every moment of every day. The turning point came in 1951, when Cage visited Harvard University and experienced something that would change his understanding of sound forever. He had come to Cambridge to spend time in one of the university's anechoic chambers, rooms specifically designed to absorb all sound, creating what scientists believe to be the closest thing possible to perfect silence. The anechoic chamber at Harvard had been built during World War II as part of research into acoustic warfare. Engineers were trying to develop better ways to broadcast instructions to troops during beach landings, and they needed a completely quiet environment to test their equipment. The chamber itself was an engineering marvel. Its walls, floor, and ceiling were covered with wedge-shaped acoustic tiles that absorbed sound waves rather than reflecting them back. When you spoke inside the chamber, your voice seemed to disappear almost before it left your mouth. Cage entered this chamber expecting to experience true silence for the first time in his life. But what he found instead was revelation. Anyway, in that silent room I heard two sounds, one high and one low. He would later recount, afterward, I asked the engineer in charge why. If the room was so silent, I had heard two sounds. He said, describe them. I did. He said, the high one was your nervous system in operation. The low one was your blood in circulation. In that moment, Cage realized something that would revolutionize his entire approach to music. True silence doesn't exist. Even in the most soundproof environment imaginable, life itself creates a soundtrack. The electrical firing of neurons, the rhythmic pumping of blood, the subtle mechanics of breathing. These biological processes generate their own quiet symphony that plays continuously beneath the threshold of normal awareness. This revelation transformed Cage's understanding of silence entirely. If perfect quiet was impossible, then what people usually called silence was actually full of sound. It was just sound that we had learned to ignore. The ambient noise of ventilation systems, the distant hum of traffic, the subtle creaking of buildings settling, the whispered conversations of audiences, all of these weren't interruptions to music. They were music waiting to be recognized and appreciated. Armed with this insight, Cage began to conceive of a composition that would make this hidden music audible. He would create a piece where the traditional sounds of music, the intentional notes played by instruments, would be absent, allowing the unintentional sounds of the environment to take center stage. The audience would become performers, their coughs and shuffles and whispered comments part of the composition. The building itself would become an instrument, its acoustic properties shaping the sound. Even the silence between sounds would become meaningful, a pregnant pause full of possibility. But creating such a piece required more than just asking a performer to sit quietly. Cage needed to provide structure, to create a framework that would give shape to the shapeless. He decided on a 3-movement composition, with the timing determined by his beloved I Ching. The total duration would be 4 minutes and 33 seconds, not because this length had any particular significance, but because the chance operations had suggested it. The score itself was a masterpiece of minimalism. Instead of notes, it contained the word tacit. a musical term meaning be silent, along with tempo markings and movement divisions. It looked like music, it was structured like music, it was published and copyrighted like music, but it contained no sounds that anyone would traditionally recognize as musical. When 433 premiered at the Maverick Concert Hall that August evening in 1952, the audience's reaction was everything Cage could have hoped for and more. Some people sat in respectful silence, trying to understand what they were experiencing. Others whispered to their companions, asking whether this was some kind of joke. A few walked out in indignation, but everyone, whether they realized it or not, was participating in the composition, adding their own sounds to the piece. Those who stayed and listened reported a remarkable experience. As the minutes passed and their ears adjusted to the absence of intentional music, they began to notice sounds they had never consciously heard before. The rustling of leaves outside the hall, the distant sound of wind moving through the pine trees, the subtle creaking of the old wooden building, their own breathing and heartbeat. It was as if someone had adjusted the volume on the world, making audible a soundscape that had been playing all along. The philosophical implications of 433 rippled outward like stones thrown into still water. If Cage could make music out of silence, what did that say about the nature of creativity itself? Was the artist someone who created something from nothing, or someone who simply drew attention to what was already there? These weren't just academic questions. They touched on fundamental assumptions about art, consciousness, and reality itself. Cage's work was deeply influenced by Eastern philosophy, particularly Zen Buddhism. He had studied with D.T. Suzuki, the Japanese scholar who introduced Zen concepts to the West, and was fascinated by the Buddhist idea of emptiness, not as nothingness but as fullness of potential. In Zen teaching, emptiness is not the absence of something, but the presence of everything. An empty cup has the potential to hold any liquid. An empty mind has the potential for any thought. Similarly, Cage's silent composition was not about the absence of music, but about the presence of all possible music. Every performance of 433 was unique because the ambient sounds were never the same twice. The piece changed with the weather, the season, the size and mood of the audience, the acoustic properties of the venue. It was infinitely variable, infinitely renewable. A composition that could never be exhausted because it was never actually repeated. What twist in this story surprised you most so far? Let me know below. I might explore your favorite philosophical angle next. This understanding of emptiness as potential connected Cage's work to broader currents in mid-20th century thought. In visual art, painters like Mark Rothko were exploring how color could suggest infinite depth, while sculptors like Alberto Giacometti were finding ways to make space itself expressive. In literature, writers like Samuel Beckett were discovering the dramatic power of what wasn't said, the meaning that lived in the gaps between words. But Cage's silent composition also connected to much older traditions. Thoreau had written about the importance of listening to nature's own music during his time at Walden Pond. Medieval mystics had spoken about the divine silence that contained all speech. Even in Western classical music, composers had long understood the expressive power of rests and pauses, the way a moment of silence could make the return of sound more powerful. What made Cage's approach revolutionary was his willingness to let silence take center stage rather than simply supporting the music around it. He was asking audiences to reconsider their most basic assumptions about what deserved their attention, what qualified as art, what counted as meaningful experience. The critical response to 433 was predictably divided. Traditional music critics dismissed it as a gimmick, a pseudo-intellectual joke designed to shock bourgeois sensibilities. They argued that it wasn't music at all, but rather an elaborate performance art piece masquerading as composition. How could something be called music if it contained no intentional sounds? How could silence be composed? But others recognized something genuinely groundbreaking in Cage's approach. They saw 433 as a profound meditation on the nature of listening itself, a composition that taught audiences how to hear the world differently. Instead of passively receiving entertainment, listeners became active participants in creating the aesthetic experience. The piece democratized music making, suggesting that everyone was already a musician simply by virtue of existing in the world and making sound. The composition also raised uncomfortable questions about elitism in classical music. If a trained pianist sitting silently at a piano was creating art, what about all the untrained people who made interesting sounds every day? What about children playing in playgrounds, workers operating machinery, birds singing at dawn? Were these activities any less musical than what happened in concert halls? These questions became more pressing as Cage's influence spread throughout the art world. Visual artists began creating silent works, empty galleries, blank canvases, invisible sculptures. Writers experimented with blank pages and wordless books. Dancers choreographed stillness. The entire avant-garde seemed to be exploring what could be expressed through absence rather than presence. Meanwhile, Cage himself continued pushing boundaries in other directions. He composed pieces for radios, asking performers to tune between stations and amplify the static. He created compositions for flower pots, kitchen utensils, and found objects. He wrote music that could only be performed outdoors, incorporating environmental sounds as integral elements. Each new piece seemed designed to expand the definition of what music could be. But it was 433 that captured the public imagination and refused to let go. The piece was performed hundreds of times over the following decades, each performance generating new discussions about art, meaning, and value. Orchestra conductors led their ensembles through silent performances. Solo pianists presented it in recital halls around the world. Rock bands incorporated it into their concerts. Each performance was simultaneously exactly the same and completely different, adhering precisely to Cage's score while creating a unique sonic experience. The piece also began to influence popular culture in unexpected ways. Television shows used moments of silence as dramatic punctuation. Radio DJs began experimenting with dead air as an aesthetic choice rather than a technical error. Even in everyday conversation, people became more aware of the expressive potential of pauses and quiet moments. But perhaps most importantly, 433 established a precedent for questioning the boundaries of intellectual property in ways that would become increasingly relevant as the 20th century progressed. By copywriting silence, Cage was making a statement about ownership and creativity that would resonate decades later in debates about sampling, remix culture, and digital rights management. Which brings us to Mike Batt, the unwitting protagonist of our copyright drama. Born in Southampton, England in 1949, Batt had built his career on an uncanny ability to navigate between high and low culture, creating music that was simultaneously commercially successful and artistically ambitious. His breakthrough had come in the 1970s with The Wombles, a children's television series about fictional creatures who lived on Wimbledon Common and collected litter. The Wombles were ostensibly an environmental education program, but Batt transformed them into a genuine pop phenomenon. The songs he wrote for the series, performed by session musicians but credited to the fictional Wombles characters, became legitimate hits, reaching the top of the British charts and spawning multiple albums. It was a surreal moment in pop history. Millions of people were dancing to songs supposedly performed by anthropomorphic creatures who lived underground and sang about recycling. But Batt's ambitions extended far beyond children's television. He had studied at the London College of Music and was deeply versed in classical composition. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, he worked as a producer and arranger for major recording artists, film composer, and even classical conductor. He had a particular gift for creating crossover projects that brought classical music to popular audiences without dumbing it down or losing its essential character. This background made him the perfect candidate to lead the Planets, a classical crossover ensemble he formed in the early 2000s. The group consisted of 4 classically trained young women, this time partnered by 4 classically trained young men, and their debut album, Classical Graffiti, was designed to showcase how classical melodies could be reimagined for contemporary audiences. The album title itself was perfectly chosen. Graffiti suggests something unauthorized, rebellious, transformative. Bat was taking the marble statues of classical music and spray painting them in bright colors, making them speak to a generation raised on rock and pop. The arrangements were lush and dramatic, incorporating electronic elements and modern production techniques while respecting the essential character of the original compositions. Most of the tracks on Classical Graffiti were straightforward enough, updated versions of pieces by Bach, Mozart, and other classical masters. But Bat decided to include something different as well, a kind of palate cleanser between the more intensive arrangements. He wanted a moment of quiet, a space for listeners to catch their breath before the next wave of orchestral energy. What he created was a 1-minute silence, exactly what the title suggested, 60 seconds of no intentional sound whatsoever. It seemed like a harmless addition to the album, a brief moment of contemplation in an otherwise busy musical landscape, but in a decision that he would later admit was motivated by a mixture of mischief and genuine artistic homage. Bat credited the track to Bat Sesh Cage. This credit was where everything went sideways. According to some accounts, Bat later explained that he had actually intended to credit the track to himself and Clint Cage, a registered pseudonym of his, rather than John Cage, the composer. But the credit as it appeared on the album clearly suggested a collaboration between Mike Bat and John Cage, which was problematic for several reasons, not least of which was that John Cage had died in 1992. A decade before Classical Graffiti was recorded. The Mechanical Copyright Protection Society, acting on behalf of the John Cage Trust, was not amused. They accused Bat of copyright infringement, arguing that his 1-minute silence was essentially a shortened version of Cage's 433 and therefore a derivative work that violated the composer's exclusive rights. The legal challenge put Bat in a fascinating position. He could have argued that silence predates Cage by several billion years, that no one could claim ownership of the absence of sound. He could have pointed out that countless musical works throughout history had included moments of silence, rests, pauses, fermatas, without anyone claiming these constituted copyright infringement. But instead, Bat chose to respond with characteristic wit and defiance. In interviews, he claimed that his silent piece was actually superior to Cage's original. "Mine is a much better silent piece," he declared. "I have been able to say in 1 minute what Cage could only say in 4 minutes and 33 seconds. It was a brilliant piece of artistic sauce, suggesting that he had somehow compressed the meaning of Cage's composition into a more efficient format." The comment perfectly captured the absurdity of the situation, while also making a serious point about the nature of artistic value. If silence could be copyrighted, then presumably some silences were better than others. And if that was the case, then perhaps the market should decide which version deserved protection. But wit and logic would prove insufficient weapons against the legal machinery of copyright enforcement. The case raised fundamental questions about what exactly could be owned in the realm of intellectual property. Copyright law traditionally protects expression, not ideas. You can't copyright the concept of love, but you can copyright a particular love song. You can't copyright the idea of a detective story, but you can copyright a specific tale of Sherlock Holmes. So where did silence fit in this framework? Was Cage's 433 an idea, the concept of making music out of ambient sound, or was it an expression, a specific arrangement of temporal and conceptual elements? The Cage estate's lawyers argued that it was clearly the latter. They pointed to the precise duration, the division into 3 movements, the detailed performance instructions, the specific context in which the silence was meant to be experienced. This wasn't just any silence, they argued. It was a carefully crafted silence, shaped by artistic intention and presented within a specific framework of meaning. The score itself, with its precise timing and structural divisions, constituted a unique expression of the concept of musical silence. Anyone who created a similar work was therefore building on Cage's intellectual property. Bat's defenders might have countered that silence is a fundamental element of human experience, as basic and unownable as breathing or thinking. They might have argued that Cage's contribution was conceptual rather than expressive, that he had identified an interesting way to think about music, but hadn't created anything that could legitimately be owned. They might have pointed out that 433 was itself built on centuries of philosophical and artistic tradition. Cage hadn't invented the concept of meaningful silence. He had simply found a particularly provocative way to present it. If his work deserved copyright protection, then perhaps he owed royalties to Zen Buddhist teachers, to John Muir writing about wilderness, to Marcel Duchamp questioning the nature of art itself. But these arguments would never be tested in court. In September 2002, Mike Batt settled with the John Cage Trust, reportedly paying a six-figure sum to resolve the dispute. The settlement was reached out of court, and its exact terms remained confidential. But the precedent was clear. In the strange world of artistic copyright, even silence had its price. The settlement sent ripples through the artistic community and beyond. Some saw it as vindication of Cage's revolutionary work, proof that his silent composition was indeed a legitimate piece of art worthy of legal protection. The fact that someone was willing to pay substantial money to avoid a lawsuit over silence suggested that 433 had real commercial value, that it was more than just an elaborate conceptual joke. Others viewed the outcome as deeply troubling, a sign that copyright law had extended so far beyond its original purpose that it was now stifling the very creativity it was meant to protect. If a minute of silence could infringe on someone's intellectual property, what was safe from legal challenge? Could jazz musicians be sued for taking too long a pause between improvised phrases? Could conductors face legal action for holding a fermata longer than usual? The questions seemed ridiculous, but then again, so had the idea of copywriting silence until it actually happened. Musicians began to joke nervously about the implications, but beneath the humor was genuine concern about how copyright expansion might affect artistic expression. If every element of musical language could potentially be owned by someone, how could new music be created without inadvertently stepping on someone else's intellectual property? The case also highlighted broader cultural conversations about authenticity and originality in the digital age. The early 2000s were a time of rapid technological change, when file sharing was disrupting traditional music industry business models, and artists were experimenting with new forms of digital creativity. Suddenly, questions about what could be owned and copied seemed more urgent than ever. If anyone with a computer could sample, remix, and redistribute existing music, then the traditional boundaries between original and derivative work were becoming increasingly blurred. In this context, the Bat case seemed to represent an extreme endpoint of copyright expansion, a world where even the absence of creative content could somehow be owned and controlled. Legal scholars began citing the case in academic papers about the limits of intellectual property. Some argued that it represented a reductio ad absurdum of copyright logic, a demonstration that the system had become so broad and aggressive that it was protecting elements that should remain in the public domain. Others suggested that it actually made perfect sense within existing copyright framework, that Cage's composition was legitimately original expression deserving of protection. The philosophical implications of the settlement extended far beyond law and economics. If silence could be copyrighted, what did that say about the nature of ownership itself? Throughout human history, property rights had typically been applied to tangible things: land, objects, livestock, Even intellectual property had traditionally focused on concrete expressions, specific books, songs, inventions. But 433 represented something different, the ownership of absence, the commodification of void. It suggested a world where not only positive creation could be owned but negative space as well. This raised profound questions about the relationship between being and non-being, presence and absence, something and nothing. The French philosopher Jacques Derrida had written extensively about what he called the metaphysics of presence, the idea that Western thought had always privileged what was there over what was absent, speech over silence, fullness over emptiness. Cage's composition seemed to challenge this hierarchy, suggesting that absence could be just as meaningful as presence. The copyright case took this challenge one step further, suggesting that absence could also be just as valuable as presence. Meanwhile, in the broader art world, artists and critics were grappling with the implications of the BAT settlement for their own work. If conceptual art could be copyrighted in such an expansive way, what did that mean for practices that had long relied on appropriation, quotation, and transformation of existing ideas? The visual art world had been dealing with similar questions for decades. When Andy Warhol created his Campbell's soup can paintings in the 1960s, was he infringing on the soup company's intellectual property? When Sherry Levine re-photographed Walker Evans' photographs in the 1980s, was she creating new art or simply stealing existing work? These questions had been largely settled through a combination of legal precedent and cultural acceptance, but the BAT case suggested that the boundaries might be shifting again. Contemporary artists who worked with silence and emptiness as materials began to wonder whether their own practices might be legally vulnerable. Yves Klein's empty gallery exhibition Lee Video from 1958 suddenly seemed potentially problematic. Could the Klein estate claim ownership of artistic emptiness? What about the minimalist sculptors of the 1960s who had made careers out of geometric simplicity and spare aesthetic choices? The questions multiplied as artists and lawyers tried to understand the scope of the precedent. If one type of silence could be copyrighted, were all silences now potentially problematic? Did the duration matter? The context? The intention behind the silence? These weren't just academic concerns, they had real implications for working artists who might find themselves on the wrong end of a copyright lawsuit. Educational institutions also found themselves grappling with the implications of the settlement. Music schools that had been teaching 433 as an example of avant-garde composition now had to consider whether student performances might constitute copyright infringement. Could a teacher assign the piece for study without paying royalties? Could students perform it in recitals without obtaining permission? Similar questions arose in other educational contexts. Philosophy professors who used Cage's composition to illustrate concepts about presence and absence wondered whether they needed to secure rights clearances for classroom discussions. Art history teachers who included 433 in surveys of conceptual art faced similar uncertainties. The internet age added another layer of complexity to these questions. Audio files of silence were notoriously difficult to distinguish from technical errors. How could copyright enforcement systems tell the difference between an intentional artistic silence and a faulty upload? Some artists began experimenting with this ambiguity, creating silence tracks that were actually very quiet recordings of ambient sound, hoping to avoid copyright issues while maintaining the aesthetic impact. Streaming services faced particular challenges as they tried to implement automated systems for detecting copyright infringement. How do you program a computer to recognize unauthorized silence? The algorithmic systems that had been developed to identify copied music were useless when applied to the absence of music. This created a strange loophole where silence might be easier to pirate than sound. Record labels and music publishers began to take notice of these complications. Some started registering their own silence compositions, hoping to establish competing claims to different types of quiet. Others began including brief moments of intentional silence in their releases, both for artistic effect and as a way of asserting ownership over specific durations and contexts of non-sound. The legal precedent also affected how new experimental music was composed and distributed. Avant-garde musicians who had previously felt free to incorporate periods of silence into their work now had to consider whether those moments might inadvertently infringe on existing copyrights. Some began adding subtle ambient sounds, barely audible drones or environmental recordings, to ensure that their quiet passages were legally distinct from pure silence. Recording engineers developed new techniques for creating legally safe silence, incorporating inaudible frequency content or room tone to distinguish their quiet passages from existing copyrighted works. It was a peculiar moment in the evolution of sound technology, professionals spending significant time and money to engineer better versions of nothing. The influence of the bat case extended into popular culture as well. Television producers began to reconsider how they used silence in their programming, worrying that dramatic pauses might constitute copyright infringement. Radio programmers faced similar concerns about dead air, which had traditionally been viewed as a technical error rather than potential intellectual property violation. Comedy writers found rich material in the absurdity of the situation. Talk show hosts made jokes about paying royalties for awkward pauses. Stand-up comedians incorporated bits about copyrighted silence into their routines. The entire scenario seemed tailor-made for satirical treatment, but the underlying legal and philosophical questions remained genuinely complex. As the years passed, the bat settlement began to influence broader discussions about intellectual property reform. Legal scholars pointed to the case as evidence that copyright law had expanded beyond reasonable bounds, protecting elements that should remain freely available for artistic use. They argued for a more restrictive approach to copyright that would distinguish between genuine creative expression and basic elements of human experience. Others defended the settlement as a logical extension of existing copyright principles. If John Cage had created a genuinely original work of art, they argued, then it deserved the same protections as any other composition. The fact that the work consisted of silence rather than sound was irrelevant to its status as intellectual property. These debates became particularly intense as digital technology continued to transform how music was created, distributed, and consumed. The rise of file-sharing networks, streaming services, and user-generated content platforms created new opportunities for both creative expression and copyright infringement. In this environment, the boundaries established by cases like Bat-Vor, Cage Trust became increasingly important precedents for future legal decisions. Musicians and composers began to develop strategies for navigating this complex landscape. Some embraced the restrictions, viewing copyright constraints as creative challenges that could inspire innovative approaches to composition. Others sought ways to work around the limitations, developing techniques for creating meaningful quiet passages that were legally distinct from existing copyrighted silences. The educational implications of the case continued to evolve as well. Music schools began offering courses on copyright law specifically designed for experimental composers. Students learned not only how to create innovative music, but also how to protect their own work and avoid infringing on others' intellectual property. The curriculum of avant-garde composition had to expand to include legal as well as artistic considerations. Academic conferences on experimental music began featuring panels on intellectual property law, alongside traditional discussions of aesthetic theory and performance practice. Musicologists found themselves needing to understand legal concepts as thoroughly as historical and analytical ones. The intersection of art and law became an increasingly important area of scholarly research. Publishers of contemporary music faced their own challenges in this new environment. They had to develop new categories for cataloging and licensing works that consisted partially or entirely of silence. Traditional systems for notating and describing music proved inadequate for these conceptual compositions, requiring new approaches to documentation and rights management. Performance venues also had to adapt to the changing legal landscape surrounding experimental music. Concert halls and clubs that had previously programmed avant-garde works freely now needed to consider whether performances might require special licensing arrangements. The bureaucratic overhead of presenting conceptual art began to influence programming decisions in ways that would have been unimaginable to earlier generations of experimental artists. The international dimensions of copyright law added another layer of complexity to these issues. Different countries had different approaches to protecting intellectual property, and what might be considered fair use in one jurisdiction could constitute infringement in another. Artists working with silence and other conceptual materials had to consider how their work might be received not just aesthetically, but legally in different parts of the world. Some countries began developing specific exemptions for educational and artistic uses of copyrighted silence, recognizing that overly broad protection might stifle legitimate creative expression. Others maintained stricter approaches, arguing that intellectual property rights needed to be consistently enforced regardless of the nature of the protected material. As the digital age matured, questions about silence and copyright intersected with broader issues about artificial intelligence and algorithmic creativity. Could a computer program compose copyrightable silence? If so, who would own the rights, the programmer, the user, or the AI system itself? These questions seemed like science fiction, but they were becoming increasingly relevant as technology continued to evolve. The emergence of virtual and augmented reality platforms added yet another dimension to these debates. How should silence be handled in immersive digital environments? Could spatial or three-dimensional silence be copyrighted differently from traditional temporal silence? The legal frameworks developed for two-dimensional media proved inadequate for these new forms of artistic expression. Throughout all these developments, John Cage's original composition remained as provocative and mysterious as ever. New performances of 433 continued to generate discussion and debate, with each presentation revealing new aspects of the piece's meaning and significance. The work seemed to anticipate and comment on its own legal controversies, raising questions about ownership and authenticity that became more rather than less relevant as time passed. Music historians began to reassess Cage's legacy in light of the copyright controversies his work had inspired. Some argued that the legal battles were a distraction from the serious philosophical and aesthetic questions the composer had raised. Others suggested that the commercial and legal dimensions of the work were inseparable from its artistic meaning, that the commodification of silence was itself part of what 433 was ultimately about. The John Cage Trust, for its part, continued to manage the composer's intellectual property portfolio with careful attention to both artistic and commercial considerations. They licensed performances and recordings of Cage's works while also supporting educational and scholarly activities related to his legacy. The balance between protecting copyrights and promoting artistic understanding remained delicate and sometimes controversial. Mike Batt, meanwhile, continued his career as a composer and producer, though presumably with greater awareness of the legal complexities surrounding artistic appropriation. His encounter with copyright law over silence had made him an inadvertent expert on intellectual property issues, and he occasionally spoke about the experience in interviews and public appearances. The story of his legal battle with the Cage estate became a cautionary tale for other artists working in experimental or conceptual modes, but it also served as inspiration for those interested in pushing the boundaries of what art could be and do. The fact that silence could be valuable enough to fight over in court suggested that even the most minimal artistic gestures could have profound cultural impact. As we look back on this strange episode in the history of intellectual property law, what stands out is not just the absurdity of fighting over nothing, but the seriousness with which all parties approached questions about art, ownership, and meaning. The legal settlement between Bat and the Cage Trust wasn't just about money. It was about fundamental questions regarding how creativity works, who gets to control it, and what happens when the traditional boundaries between something and nothing begin to break down. The case revealed tensions that continue to shape debates about intellectual property in the digital age. As artificial intelligence, virtual reality, and other emerging technologies create new possibilities for artistic expression, the questions raised by Cage's silent composition become increasingly relevant. Can absence be owned? Should it be? What are the limits of creative ownership in a world where the tools of art making are becoming democratized and the boundaries between creator and audience are dissolving? These questions have only grown more complex as streaming platforms have begun grappling with the peculiar economics of silence. When Spotify or Apple Music pays royalties based on listening time, how should they handle tracks that consist entirely of quiet? Some artists began gaming the system by uploading extended periods of silence, hoping to collect micropayments from listeners who fell asleep with their devices playing. The platforms responded by implementing minimum volume thresholds and other technical measures to distinguish between intentional music and background noise. But these technological solutions raised their own philosophical problems. If a streaming algorithm couldn't tell the difference between copyrighted silence and incidental quiet, what did that say about the nature of the artistic content itself? Was the value of Cage's composition really embedded in the absence of sound or in the conceptual framework that surrounded that absence? The rise of ambient music and sound art in the 21st century has made these questions more than academic. Brian Eno, whose pioneering work in ambient music often featured extended quiet passages, has spoken about the influence of Cage's ideas on his own compositions. But Eno's ambient works occupy a legal gray area. They contain sound, but often so minimal and atmospheric that the line between intentional composition and environmental audio becomes blurred. Sleep music, meditation apps, and wellness platforms have created entirely new markets for quiet audio content. Companies like Calm and Headspace have built multi-million-dollar businesses around carefully crafted soundscapes that often include substantial periods of near silence. The legal questions raised by the Bat case suddenly seem less abstract when applied to these commercial applications of therapeutic quiet. Some entrepreneurs have even tried to create businesses around selling different types of silence. One company offers premium quiet recordings made in acoustically perfect environments, while another markets artisanal silence captured in locations with specific cultural or historical significance. The commodification of nothing has become a legitimate business model, validating Cage's early intuitions about the commercial potential of emptiness. The art world, meanwhile, has continued to grapple with the implications of conceptual ownership. When the anonymous street artist Banksy's Girl with Balloon partially shredded itself immediately after being sold at auction in 2018, critics noted parallels to Cage's exploration of art that exists in the space between presence and absence. The work's value seemed to increase precisely because it had partially destroyed itself, suggesting that loss and emptiness could be more valuable than completion and fullness. Contemporary artists working with disappearance, erasure, and absence have had to navigate the legal precedents established by cases like Bat versus the Cage Trust. Some have chosen to work collaboratively with the estates of deceased conceptual artists, securing permissions and paying licensing fees for works that reference earlier explorations of emptiness. Others have developed techniques for creating legally distinct forms of absence, using barely perceptible sounds or environmental elements to differentiate their work from existing copyrighted silences. The influence of the case has extended into unexpected areas of popular culture. Video game designers creating moments of quiet contemplation in their interactive experiences have had to consider whether extended periods of silence might constitute copyright infringement. Film directors incorporating long pauses into their work have faced similar questions, particularly when distributing their movies internationally across different copyright jurisdictions. Social media platforms have encountered their own challenges with copyrighted quiet. When users upload videos that include periods of silence, automated content recognition systems struggle to determine whether those moments constitute fair use, original creation, or potential infringement. The technical infrastructure of the internet, it turns out, was not designed to handle the legal complexities of owning nothing. The educational implications of the BAT settlement have continued to evolve as well. Philosophy professors teaching courses on aesthetics and meaning now routinely include discussion of the case as an example of how abstract concepts can have concrete legal and economic consequences. Law schools have begun offering courses on intellectual property issues and conceptual art, recognizing that traditional approaches to copyright education were inadequate for addressing the realities of contemporary artistic practice. Music therapy programs have had to consider whether their use of silence and quiet in therapeutic contexts might require licensing arrangements. The healing applications of structured quiet, which have been recognized by healthcare systems around the world, suddenly became complicated by questions about who owned the rights to specific types of therapeutic silence. Religious institutions have faced similar questions about their use of contemplative quiet in worship services. Many spiritual traditions incorporate periods of silence as integral elements of religious practice, but the legal precedents established by copyright cases like Bat versus Cage have created uncertainty about whether these ancient practices might somehow infringe on contemporary intellectual property rights. The international dimensions of these issues have become increasingly complex as global communication networks make it easier for artistic works to cross national boundaries. What constitutes fair use of silence in one country might be considered infringement in another, creating challenges for artists, educators, and spiritual practitioners who work in international contexts. Some countries have responded to these challenges by developing specific legal frameworks for protecting traditional uses of silence and quiet. Indigenous communities, in particular, have argued that their ancestral practices of ceremonial silence should be protected from commercial appropriation, adding another layer of cultural and legal complexity to debates about who can own absence. The emergence of virtual reality and augmented reality technologies has created entirely new categories of questions about silence and space. In immersive digital environments, silence can have spatial dimensions, quiet zones within three-dimensional soundscapes that users can navigate and experience. The legal frameworks developed for traditional audio recordings seem inadequate for addressing these new forms of experiential emptiness. Artificial intelligence systems trained on musical datasets have begun generating their own compositions that include periods of silence, raising questions about whether AI-created quiet can be copyrighted, and if so, who would own the rights. Some researchers have experimented with training neural networks specifically on silence, creating algorithms that can generate what they call optimized emptiness for various applications. The cryptocurrency and blockchain worlds have even found ways to tokenize and trade silence as a digital asset. NFT marketplaces now feature collections of conceptual audio that exist primarily as metadata describing absent sounds. The speculative market in digital art has embraced the paradox of buying and selling nothing, creating new forms of value around the idea of ownership itself. As we near the present day, the questions raised by John Cage's silent composition and Mike Batt's inadvertent copyright infringement seem more relevant than ever. In an age when anyone can create and distribute audio content globally, when artificial intelligence can generate music automatically, When virtual worlds can contain infinite varieties of silence, the fundamental questions about creativity, ownership, and meaning that Cage first raised in 1952 have become central to how we understand culture itself. The story of the man who tried to copyright silence reveals something essential about the relationship between art and law, between creativity and commerce, between something and nothing. It shows us that even the most abstract philosophical questions can have concrete consequences, that the boundaries between art and property are constantly being negotiated and renegotiated, and that sometimes the most important artistic statements are the ones that seem to say nothing at all. Perhaps most importantly, it reminds us that silence, whether copyrighted or not, whether owned or free, remains one of the most powerful forces in human experience. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, the ability to create meaningful quiet becomes increasingly valuable, regardless of who claims to own it. John Cage understood this when he first conceived of 433 in that anechoic chamber at Harvard. He realized that silence wasn't empty. It was full of possibility, full of the sounds we usually ignore, full of the space where thoughts and feelings and new ideas could emerge. The fact that this realization could eventually become valuable enough to fight over in court might have amused him, but it would not have surprised him. Cage had always believed that art should challenge our assumptions about what was possible, what was valuable, what deserved our attention. The legal battles that grew up around his silent composition were simply another form of performance, another way that his ideas about the relationship between presence and absence continued to provoke and inspire long after the original notes, or lack thereof, had faded away. Mike Batt's encounter with the copyright system over his 1-minute silence was more than just a legal curiosity. It was a moment when the abstract questions of experimental art collided with the practical realities of commercial culture, when the philosophical became personal, when the theoretical became expensive. His willingness to pay a substantial settlement rather than fight the case in court suggests that even he recognized there was something genuinely valuable in what Cage had created, not just the silence itself, but the conceptual framework that made that silence meaningful. Today, as new technologies continue to transform how we create, distribute, and experience art, the precedents established by cases like Batt versus the Cage Trust continue to influence how we think about creativity and ownership. The questions they raised about the nature of intellectual property, the limits of copyright protection, and the relationship between art and commerce remain as relevant and complex as ever. And in the end, perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for John Cage's silent composition. Not that it provided definitive answers to these questions, but that it ensured we would keep asking them. In a world that often seems to have forgotten the value of quiet contemplation, 433 continues to create space for reflection, discussion, and discovery. Whether that space can be owned or should be free remains an open question, but the conversation itself has become part of the composition, an ongoing performance that includes all of us as participants. The next time you find yourself in a moment of unexpected quiet, waiting for a subway train, sitting in a doctor's office, lying awake in the early morning, you might remember this strange tale of copyrighted silence, and listen a little more carefully to what emptiness has to say. After all, whether it belongs to John Cage, Mike Batt, or all of us together, silence is still composing its endless symphony all around us, waiting for anyone willing to sit still long enough to hear it. If you're curious about more hidden stories where philosophy meets the everyday world in unexpected ways, our next deep dive explores how a single misprint in a 19th century chemistry textbook accidentally created the color that would define an entire artistic movement, and why the artist who discovered it spent the rest of his life trying to keep it secret.